Hello everyone, this is Space Cafe Podcast and I am Marcus. Welcome to the other side. I hope you had a good start into the new year 2022. I already like it. For this episode, we invited a good friend from over at SpaceWatch.Global into the studio. Steven Freeland has his own show, Space Law Breakfast, which I strongly encourage you to check out.
So don't ask me any questions that make me angry, please, Marcus.
We invited Steven because he's probably one of the best people to talk to when it comes to framing things and discussing larger perspectives. What will this year bring? Which big topics from 2021 should we rather not forget, and which jobs will be interesting this year? And last but not least, where is space law headed? Where is new space headed? Steven is a wonderful guest who gives hope for the future. Ready for it? I am.
Shall I press the record now?
Have fun. And go. Can you briefly introduce yourself with your name and what you do?
Sure. My name is Steven Freeland. I'm an academic at Western Sydney University, where I'm an emeritus professor, and at Bond University, where I'm a professorial fellow. I'm a co-principal in a space specialized law firm called Azimuth Advisory with the woman of my dreams, my wife. And I advise governments on their space frameworks, laws, policy, strategies. I've done that for about a dozen governments. And recently I've been appointed by the United Nations to co-chair a working group on space resources, a 5-year working group that will take us on a path that 100 plus countries agree on in terms of proposed activities to extract or exploit or utilize space resources. So I am an international lawyer. I do a bit of diplomatic work, I suppose, an academic, and I'm really concerned in a positive way for that whatever we do for the greater benefit of humanity.
You just said an important term, space resources, because this is usually something where humans are very good at exploiting resources and trying to make as much profit as they can. So are we seeing a new race for resources, like wild animals going crazy for their next lunch or dinner?
Well, that's a really good question. And the answer is not simple. Part of the answer will depend on who you ask. Mm-hmm. Those that, for example, think that we should, as quickly as possible, be looking off Earth to exploit whatever might be valuable there, will say to you that whatever we can extract off Earth will be of the benefit to humanity if we can perhaps utilize it back on Earth to replenish. And we can do that without further causing environmental damage to Earth, because clearly the extraction of resources on Earth in most cases is not positive for the environment, and typically is negative, and the replenishment doesn't work. There are others who you talk to who say, well, that ignores the fact that we have to be as cognizant of the universe around us in the short universe and in the longer universe. And we shouldn't be just looking at space as a place to exploit resources, and the environmental consequences of that be damned. And then if you look at it in the middle, some will say, well, there are good aspects and bad aspects, but the difficulty is that with the plans that have emerged for the idea of resource exploitation, ultimately, the original plans were, as I expressed at the beginning, let's go up there, let's find valuable resources like, for example, the talk about helium-3 on the moon, and let's bring it back and create energy in a way that benefits humanity. The problem with that is there are massive technological challenges of going there, landing, extracting, taking off and landing back here again. But also because most of this will be driven by private enterprise, or a lot of it will be driven by private enterprise, the business case does not work in terms of going up there, getting things and bringing it back in sort of larger quantities. And so the discussion now is moving to a different discussion, which is let's go up there, let's see what we can exploit, but let's utilize that not to bring back to Earth, but to create an off-Earth economy. Utilize those resources to create a market which will help others in their own space activities, either to support their missions or to create fuel out of the water that might be extracted, for example, on the moon. And so the marketplace there is a marketplace off Earth. And, it'll be interesting to see how and if that could develop. But of course, a market requires buyers and sellers, and there'll only be a limited number of sellers because there'll only be a limited number of countries and corporates who in, the next 20 or 30 or years are capable of doing the exploitation. But likewise, there'll only be a limited number of buyers who have the capability to have those activities that could benefit from those resources. And so that, I have to be neutral on this because of the role I have, helping the countries at COPPOS find their way forward. But that limited buyer and seller market will then at least raise questions about, is this really something that creates a benefit for the whole of humanity? Of course, you can construct arguments to say, yes, if this helps further exploration, it helps us understand our place in the universe, it helps us understand scientific missions. Of course, that's a benefit to humanity, but it's a different sort of benefit to humanity to the one that was originally planned, which is let's bring back these metals, or let's bring back this, helium-3 or whatever, and help us on Earth, and stop us from having to further, dig up the Earth, if you like, and replace it with things that have been garnered from offshore.
What do you think is the main driver behind all this, is behind the new space industry? Is the main driver that the market is finding itself a new market, a new place to thrive, or is it human curiosity? So what is the driver behind the new space movement?
I think it's a combination of those and other things as well. It's certainly human curiosity, but that was a driver of old space as well. We've always had that fascination for areas that are, in a sense, beyond us initially, and we want to go to the depths of the ocean, we want to go into the airspace, we want to go into outer space. So human curiosity has always been there and will continue, and that will drive us forward. And human curiosity is a wonderful, wonderful thing. We should never in any way discourage that. Secondly, what else is driving it is geopolitics and politics, because space is a wonderful thing, but amongst many other factors, it's highly strategic, highly politic. It allows countries to beat their chest and say, look at how good we are at our technology. It raises pride within the country for technological achievements. So it's politic. It's commercial. The space economy. So it's also driven by commercial considerations. The space economy is one of the very few economies that continued to grow, even in the depths of COVID, when the world economy was retracting. The space economy, along with the pharmaceutical economy and the digital economy, continued to grow. And even though it's still a, small fraction of the global economy as a whole, it's growing at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times the growth of the global economy. So it's growing at an exponential rate. So there are commercial drivers. There are also technological drivers, because as we develop capabilities to do things in space, and this is where benefits do inure to us, that allows us to create capabilities that are also highly beneficial on Earth. So, for example, there's talk about developing rovers on Moon. We've already got rover technology on Moon and Mars. Dust is a major problem. And so creating that technology for rovers, and then maybe ultimately rovers that can extract or something off Earth, actually is a great benefit to mining companies on Earth. Because, if they can do it in a more efficient way, it'll save them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So there are benefits in terms of the technology. So there are many, many drivers, I think, for this. But we really have to be careful, because if you look at the history of warfare on Earth, so many wars and conflicts have been driven by a quest for territory because of a quest for resources. And we just have to ensure that whatever happens, and I'm not saying it will happen, but if in the end these activities do become something that take place, we have to ensure that they're done in the most appropriate, peaceful way.
This is where policymakers come into play, and this is where space law comes into play. What do you think? Is it possible, by what you've been just saying, that those agreements necessary for a peaceful future in space, those agreements will be made peaceful? Is that possible, or will the players involved battle it out as they have done it in the past? Or have there been a historic example where you would say, look, back in the day, they found peaceful agreements for this and that, so why shouldn't we be able to do it again?
Many people call me an optimist, and that may also be your suggestion after what I'm about to say, but I think I'm a realist. So I think in the end, the only way, and this is not just limited to resources, this is limited to many other types of activities in space, and indeed on Earth, the really big issues. But when it comes to the way we move forward in space, on these really big issues, we need to find a way where everybody has a buy-in in the process of determining the rules of the road. They may not agree entirely, but everybody has, you'll have to find compromises along the way. But in my opinion, at least, the idea that you'll have various clusters of countries, and of course, for some of them, they're corporates under their jurisdiction, acting under different rules, doing the same activity in space. For example, to make it sort of real for people, if we had exploitation activities going on the Moon, and you had cluster of one group acting under one sort of set of rules as between themselves, and then another cluster acting nearby or wherever under another set of rules, and those rules don't necessarily overlap or coalesce, you could have real problems. Plus, given the highly, highly political and sensitive nature of everything in space, and the fact that we are at the moment translating terrestrial tensions into that extraterrestrial space, it has the propensity, if we're not careful, to go wrong. But from my perspective, and this is where the optimism/realism comes in, we have no choice but to find a way forward together after hard bargaining. But we have no choice because in the end, for some of these really big things, it's too big for countries to work in, or at least feel that they can operate in isolation, irrespective of what others feel or think or whatever. And in the end, particularly the major spacefaring nations, who are the ones who have, at least at the moment, the greatest capabilities and ambitions to do things. In the end, if we were to go down the wrong path, they are the ones who will suffer the most because at the moment they have the greatest capabilities. They're able to do things. It's propelled them forward in so many ways. But of course, they become more and more vulnerable if things go wrong, if people make bad decisions, etc. in space. And so even though you may not like me and I may not like you, it's in our common interest to find a way forward where we can both coalesce. Has there been an example in the past? For space, there's been an example. One of them is, and this is again cause for my optimism/realism. We've got another natural resource in space, the geostationary orbit. And you will know, of course, Marcus, and many of the people listening know that also was an area where in the beginning, very few could have access. They were utilizing it as much as possible. But given the legal characteristics of space and the way we designate it as an area where we all have a stake, others were saying, wait a minute. This belongs to all of us. And ultimately, and it did take a long time. I'm not naive to suggest these things can be solved quickly, but ultimately we have found a way to manage that. Nothing is perfect, but we manage it. 193 countries, I think, are involved in that process of managing it. And we haven't had a war over geostationary orbital slots. Of course, it's competitive, but we have. So I think because it is in our interests to find a way, and particularly the major countries, but it's in all of our interests, I think we will find a way. But in the meantime, people are going to posture. People are going to try to maximize their advantage and their technological capabilities. But that's why it's important that we have these processes that, for example, United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses, where everybody has an opportunity to have a buy-in. Process is as important as substance when it comes to these big issues, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Wonderful. Thank you. Stephen, looking back on a turbulent year coming to an end, do you have a personal favorite space moment in 2021?
I think the fact that we've had the development of technology that is directed around trying to help ourselves with the problem of space debris. So the launch of a number of really quite significant, albeit test or experimental technologies by Astroscale, by Northrop Grumman, by ESA, about things that might be able to at least alleviate some of the larger pieces of debris. For me, that's a highlight. Why is that a highlight? It's a highlight because we're now beginning to address our minds to, recognizing that space is wondrous and we should be trying to enjoy the benefits, but we're now addressing our minds to a longer term plan, which is how can we continue to have all of these incredible benefits for humanity going forward, for our generation, for your children, Marcus, for your children's children, etc. And I think it is a slow but important change of thinking. And, I think the most important thing we have to think about is the way we think about space and the language we use to describe space, to move it away from, and this is hard given the geopolitical situation in the world, move it away from the notion that I've just got to do as much as I can for my own benefit and not worry about elsewhere, to, well, we're in this together and we need to start working out ways where we can coalesce in a way that we can coalesce for generations to come. And so for me, I suppose it was that change of thinking, which is then manifested in the idea that companies and agencies are spending, really lots of money and lots of energy and capabilities and resources to try to find ways. Sure, they want to make money in the meantime, but try to find ways where we can perhaps do it better. So for me, that's probably the highlight. 2021 was a big step forward in some of those activities, but we still have a long, long way to go.
Maybe it's a naive point to make, but it's like in a troubled marriage, humanity has a chance to try anew now that we are able, from a technological perspective, to go into new territory and do things differently than we have done them so far. And we know that our way of life has produced quite a bit of issues and mayhem on the planet. So to you as an expert for space law, and do you have the impression that we are about to reiterate history, or that we are about to venture into something new?
I think we're at a crossroads, to be honest, Marcus. I think, the history of humankind has always been that, notwithstanding what we say, we don't learn from our mistakes of the past. History does tend, especially with the errors, if you like, tend to repeat itself. Part of my international law practice is I'm an international criminal lawyer as well. I work a lot with the International Criminal Court. And how many times have we said never again after, witnessing genocides through history? And yet, we repeat the same mistakes and, mistakes in a really tragic way. So we are at a crossroads, and this is where I think it's important to make sure, and I say this often to people, there are many voices about space. And I know, Marcus, you've spoken to many amazing people who have different voices. And it's important to hear all of those voices, not just, in a sense, the loudest voices in the room. And so space is about culture. It's about religion. It's about science. It's about wonder. It's about benefits. It's also about military and national security and commerce and politics and exploration. It's about so many things. So we need to move away, I think, from rekindling the initial space age. I just wrote a piece which, in fact, has just been published on Torsten's platform about, someone asked me to write about the space race. And in my view, we've had about 3 or 4 different races in space. And the first space race was a strategic space race driven by geopolitics, given the timing of it during the Cold War. And, we've also had an arms race, and we've had a commercial race. And there's a danger that we have rekindled anew the strategic space. People talking about space as just another warfighting domain, and it needs to be dominated, or, etc. And of course, from my perspective, the important race is preventing an arms race, yes, but going further and actually instigating positively a peace race in space. And people say, well, of course, that's naive. It's never going to happen. But I can't see why not. I mean, the treaty regime we have is all about peaceful uses of space. The diplomatic moves actually are about creating other principles to build on that regime to stop irresponsible behavior. But the most important thing is, in the end, diplomats and decision makers will make decisions with, by and large, relatively short-term views. And it's really up to the other voices. Civil society has so much of a role to play, the broad sector of civil society. has so much of a role to play in persuading and dissuading decision makers from repeating the same mistakes. It's not easy, but I think in the end, the more people who understand the complexities of space, the fragility of space, but yet how space and the future of humanity are intricately tied together. We destroy space, we go back to the Dark Ages, literally. We certainly wouldn't be having this conversation over the airwaves.
Sure.
But everything collapses. And so the more people understand that there's so much more to lose if we get it wrong, I think the more the pendulum will move towards the right sort of decisions. Again, it's not easy. Changing established and entrenched views is difficult. Changing the way we do things is difficult. But I think realistically we have no choice. And I think necessity is really an important mother of invention. I don't know whether that's a German idiom as well, but in English we say,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes I have the impression that, especially considering the current pandemic and what it produces, what kind of friction it produces in our societies, that we need some sort of mediation, an intermediary to help us come to terms with ourselves. And especially when it comes to communication, because the pandemic is clearly showing us that too many voices at the same table can also produce chaos. And I think I need to correct myself. Those voices are not at the same table. Those voices are shouting from out of their bubbles, producing their thing, and think that it's their world is also my world. So from your perspective, you are at very important tables, especially when it comes to lawmaking, decision-making, policy-making for space. What are expert strategies to come to terms with this cacophony of voices?
Wouldn't it be great if we had all the answers? And you're absolutely right. Look, if ever we should be speaking with one voice, it's about the pandemic. If ever we should be speaking with one voice, it's about climate change. And on both of those really fundamental issues, we're not. And so you're absolutely right. There are many different voices. Those voices are speaking with a parochial perspective. There are so many vested interests. It's being driven a lot by commercial interests as well. And it's not being driven by humanistic interests as much as perhaps it should. I think space, I'm not saying space is easier. Space is as complex, but space is all about humanity. I mean, the very essence of space, our future is tied to space, but it reflects the wonder of space. Every person on the planet is touched by space. You know, the discussions that I had the honor of co-chairing are about, for example, the moon and other celestial bodies. Every person on the planet is touched by the moon. Every person on the planet would have a view if all of a sudden the moon was not there, or if the moon was irreparably changed in some way. And of course, that would also have impacts on so many things that happen on Earth because of the tidal relationship. So I think it's about language and perspective. What I think, we have an advantage in one sense of space in that the way we've characterized it from a legal perspective and from a geopolitical perspective in one sense. It's an area where we all have a stake in it. So, and we've discounted in any way, shape or form the ability for territorial claims. Now, of course, in the future with this notion of resources, we have to very much keep that in mind, but that's the way space is. So space, there's a global stakeholder in space, and that's all of it. So that's a good starting point. for the next level of discussion, which is what are the consequences of that global perspective being disregarded and allowing for parochial perspectives to play a part. And the beauty, I think, of having a central forum, and many people criticize the United Nations. And of course, there are many things about the United Nations that could be much, much better. And, does it reflect, the way society is, particularly in the Security Council, etc. But in space, we have an institution, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Many people criticize it and say, look, it takes too long. Think we've got to have decisions straight away and this process and it's all compromise, etc. But let me give you this analogy or this story. This year has been a turbulent year geopolitically on Earth. It is impossible to find consensus amongst everybody on anything. If ever we should be finding consensus, it should be on the pandemic and on climate change. Absolutely impossible. Yet, on the issue of the work that I'm now involved with, what do we think about the idea of the exploration, exploitation and utilization of space resources, which is a huge issue in the space context? We have found consensus. We found consensus, notwithstanding there are so many different vested interests. So COPPABOS has shown itself, as long as you can develop trust, it's a trust issue. It's making sure that everybody has the opportunity to speak. And my co-chair, who's this wonderful lawyer in Poland, Andrzej Misztal, and myself, we've really been cognizant of the idea that we have to ensure that everybody has a voice. Every country has a voice. And start off with allowing everybody to express their views in a non-judgmental way. Now that sounds easier than it is because there's always vested interests, even in that multilateral level. But I think it's a matter of developing trust. It's changing the language so that what you're trying to achieve is a win-win situation. And that doesn't necessarily need economic incentives, but it needs some incentives on all sides. Recognizing that actually there's more to be gained by finding a way forward. So those that want to engage in certain activities can do it with a much greater degree of knowledge that it's not going to turn into a complex situation. And others who are watching and hoping that benefits inure, and hopefully they will, can be safer in the knowledge that they've contributed to this process. They've had their voice heard. Now, we're not going to agree with everything, but I think it's really a matter of understanding where people are coming from and generating a consensus of language. It's a consensus of language and thinking. Of course, that's what consensus is all about, finding a compromise. But on these highly sensitive ones, it's a matter of ensuring that every voice is heard. Obviously, some have greater interest in the particular subject matter, but I think that doesn't necessarily mean that others, given the way we view space, don't have a stake in their ability to speak. And so it's trying to find a way that is pragmatic, that is inclusive, that is accommodating of everybody's voice, that is rational, that is non-judgmental, that is respectful. All of those are adjectives that I think combine. And so far we've had success. Of course, it's just the beginning. Ours is a 5-year working group, and we were only established in June of this year. But even since then, you've seen such good faith in the room. Where else at the moment can you find countries that are at loggerheads diplomatically on Earth? Where else can you find them actually agreeing with each other on really big issues? And I think that's the value of having them all in the room. And and taking a long considered holistic point rather than trying to go for quick fixes. And because I think quick fixes or band-aid solutions or, will just allow you to go ahead and do what you do, notwithstanding others don't agree. I think in the end, that's a short-term solution, but we really need to look for long-term solutions. So I haven't really answered your question because there is no magic bullet. It's a personality thing. It's a language thing. It's a trust thing.
But you know what, Steven, you know what I really like about that approach? It reflects so much the predicament that globalized, decentralized communication brings to the table, because when we stop to talk to one another face to face without the technological intermediary between us, it's a completely different kind of communication. So maybe this is one of the reasons or one of the problems we're confronted with, that we are lacking face-to-face communication, because it produces or it transports so many different layers of nonverbal communication.
Oh, I completely agree. And so in our meetings for our working group, you've got 100 countries in the quote unquote in the room. This year, of course, we've had to have those meetings by and large online meetings, right? You can imagine how complex that is. You've got simultaneous translation in 6 languages. You've got people dropping in and dropping out. And of course, you don't have that opportunity to say, okay, Marcus, why don't you and I go and have a coffee and just talk about this. You don't have those quote unquote chat room type facilities. So, and yet even still, we were able to reach consensus, on a whole range of important, issues about our mandate. But I completely agree. I am so excited, as we all are, that at some stage, and hopefully it's sooner rather than later, we can all get together in Vienna, for example, where Kopos is, and actually all be in the room together and go and have those coffees and bring people from different delegations together and say, okay, guys, let's have a discussion. You said this and you said this. Let's have a chat over some strudel. So I agree with you. And it's body language, and it's, again, this notion of trust. It's hard to develop trust over these airwaves. You develop trust because of your instinct, the look, the feel, the smell of the person, the sound of the person.
And
right?
There's a strange digital veil between us. Yes. Also us right now, between you and myself. So there's something being filtered out. And so maybe this could be a business model. So whoever is listening right now, that's the business model where you could become a bazillionaire, I guess, to find a technology that brings in what is being filtered out right now when it comes to human communication.
I think that's a wonderful idea. I had a friend of mine many years ago who was technologically so much more advanced than I, and he had this idea to develop technology where you would have a piece of glass, and you could walk up to that glass and touch it, and someone in the other side of the world would be at the other side of the glass. And, of course, you're still separated, as you say, by this barrier, but you're actually almost touching hands and speaking to each other. I agree. And I think we're doing quite well for being 11,000 kilometers apart from each other.
Yes.
But this conversation would be so much richer if we were sitting down over a coffee. Yes, I agree with you completely. Yeah.
Absolutely. Steven, where do you see the space industry headed in the near future?
Well, if you just look at my country, Australia, and, we are not a space power in the sense of, Russia and China and India and the United States and UK and Canada and others. But, we're a sophisticated country. Just, if you look at the plans of some of the companies here in Australia, if they come to fruition, and of course space is hard, we've got people launching, building, putting together rovers, putting together space tugs, putting together cameras, so that in a sense, the industry in one sense is only being restricted by our imagination, clearly technologically as well. So if you can overcome those technological difficulties, there are amazing and incredible opportunities to move forward. And of course, that poses challenges for law and regulation and rules of the road. The law will always be behind, but we need to create rules of the road that are flexible, yet sort of fit for purpose or capable of being upgraded. However, that leads to another conundrum for me, which is space is hard, right? And space is about humanity, and the overarching concern for me is that space is for humanity's sake. Of course, people can make money along the way. Countries can develop their infrastructure in a positive way. Of course. But space, fundamentally is about humanity. And we have to, in my opinion, as we can do more and more things, we need to start being a bit circumspect about what we should be doing. And I don't mean from a legal perspective, although of course I do mean that, but I mean from other perspectives, so that, crudely speaking, if we can now do 500 things in space, 500 different types of things, we, I think, need to start prioritizing as a collective. And of course, this is very difficult because decision making is usually made on a parochial national basis. But as a collective, we need to start prioritizing what are the types of activities. So to give you an example, and this is not meant as a criticism, but there were plans, for example, to create love hotels in space. When Mir was in its dying days, I think it was a Japanese company, I could be wrong, had plans to purchase it and create a love hotel and send honeymooners there, which is fine. But that would take an awful lot of time, effort, money, resources, expertise, and utilization of space, etc. And one has to think, and I don't mean this in any way as a judgmental, although it sounds like it, is that in our top 300 things that we should, as a humanity, be spending our efforts on, when there are so many other things that can be done in space that will, I would say, create greater benefits. And of course, people will say, well, it's a free market, and as long as they're not breaking laws, let them do whatever they want. But I think, space is a reflection of who we are. What we do is also a reflection of who we are. We need to respect space, and I think we just need to start thinking about it. So I can see the industry, assuming we can find the rules of the road to accommodate that, I can see the industry just generating more and more and more ideas and opportunities. But we need, I think, to be a bit, not restrictive, but we need to really be discreet in the way we adjudicate things. And that sort of has come to the fore a little bit with this discussion after, and one has to say, the great technological successes of Virgin and Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and their flights during the year, which for many would have been the answer to your question about the highlight. But then people start saying, well, is space tourism, if it is to be a thing, is it just for the rich and, and powerful, and a plaything of the rich? And so that started this discussion about, well, would it not be better for those people with incredible capabilities and really great people and great technology to perhaps be utilizing it in a slightly different way? Now, that's not for me to say, but I think it's a discussion that we need to think. And the other part of that is when and if we start having more and more humans in space on a permanent basis, be it in space stations, but then ultimately if people are to be, if plans move forward, permanent settlements on celestial bodies, let's say the moon, I won't even think about Mars at the moment, but say on the moon, we also need to think about, how will they live? What rules will allow them to live in a dignified way? What rights will they have? What obligations do they have? What happens when things go wrong? Do they have a right to be rescued? What happens, in terms of the need to continually give them resources, fly things to them? There were notions, as you know, a few years ago of the one-way trip to Mars. And the one-way trip to Mars idea gave rise to real questions. We actually spoke to a couple of people who were on the short list of, 1,000 or 2,000 people. And we said to them, do you really understand that, what it is that you are interested in doing? Do you really understand that if things go wrong, do you have rights in terms of being rescued or supplied with things or whatever? And so we need to start working out not only rules of the road in terms of industry and countries and companies, but also the way that human beings will interact in space on a more permanent basis. And I think that's an exciting thing, but it's also
people
quite
will remember
thing.
that proposal, and it was, as I understand it, the instigators of that were the Big Brother people. And they were going to, in a sense, commercialize that by, as they were whittling down from the whatever tens of thousands of people who initially put their name down they were going to start having interviews and in-depth with the personalities of those people. And that's how they were going to make money. And of course, as everybody knows, it all did not, it all fell apart and probably that was to be predicted. But in the course of that, I had the pleasure of speaking to 3 or 4 people who were on the, I don't know how far they got, but maybe the last 1,000 in that short list. And was interested in talking to them about what motivates them and what do they think will happen if they are chosen and they go one way to Mars. And of course, there's the curiosity that you mentioned, the adventure, the romanticism of it, making a mark for yourself, making your family proud, all of those really positive attributes. But then when you drill down a bit and I would ask them, in a sense, almost as their lawyer, although I wasn't, well, what do you think's going to happen if things go wrong? Do you think they will come and rescue you, given that you're on Mars? Do you think, what happens if you can't grow food or something happens? Do you think they're going to supply you? What rights do you have? How are you going to interact with the 3 or 4 or 10 or people who are there when things go wrong? And what safeguards are there? And so people, I don't think, really had thought about, well, how will it work in practice? How will I live there? And how will I interact with each other? And
it's not just another field trip.
No, humans take their frailties everywhere. People are going to want to get married in space. They're going to want to have kids. They're going to kill each other, and let alone all the other things. And so, I think one of the things that will hold us back are the frailties, or the vulnerabilities of the human spirit and human nature, notwithstanding all the really positive things. But yet that curiosity that you mentioned drives us forward. The technological urge to be able to do these things drives us forward. And so, as well as trying to work out rules of the road that will allow this technology and the activities, we also need to work out rules that will allow human beings to interact in a way that in a relatively positive way, given that incredibly harsh environment they'll be in. And I don't think people have really thought yet about that human spirit. I mean, we see incredible examples of bravery and courage and innovation amongst those that have been in space, the 600 or so astronauts that have been in space, particularly on the space station or on Mir when there have been crises. Apollo 13, the repairing of damage with spacewalks, incredible bravery. But even then, there are many stories about the astronauts, in those confined spaces, finding it difficult sometimes to interact. And so if you multiply that by a permanency, then, it will be interesting to see. But I think, it's not going to happen in my lifetime or your lifetime, Marcus, but it will, ultimately we think it will happen. Maybe it could be in 100 years. And we need to work out how humanity and humans will be able to live together. We're never going to have tens and tens of billions of people off Earth. Stephen Hawking said the future of humanity is off Earth. I don't believe that, but we'll certainly.
Why not? Why not?
Well, how many are we here? 8 billion. And how many realistically can we in the next, 100 years, deliver safely to stable environments where they can live permanently? We are still a way off from understanding all of the massive challenges of having a permanent presence on the moon, and everything that goes with that. How will the human body react to the low gravity and the higher radiation and the deprivation of all sorts of foods and etc.
You know what I'm Googling as we speak? I was just wondering how many crew there were on Kirk's Enterprise, Star Trek, and
yeah,
I'm reading up. It's they had a crew of 430, 14 science labs, observations. So you need 430 people to explore the universe.
Okay,
here's your number.
Okay, it's 430.
Yeah.
But how do you choose those 430? And it has to be a representation of so many different cultures and expertise and, and yet you have to be careful of the personalities. Even astronauts who go through incredible training and psychological
human beings.
testing.
They're still human beings. Yeah.
And we've even had a couple of examples of astronauts doing, human things, showing their frailties,
like drilling holes into the International Space Station.
That I don't know, but we had quite recently the idea that one astronaut had broken the law while she was on board the space station, illegally gaining access to her former partner's bank account on Earth. Oh, did you not hear this? And everybody's going, oh my goodness, crime in space. How are we going to do this? Actually, from a legal perspective, that was a pretty easy one. What law applies, because it was in the US module of the space station, and it was a US astronaut allegedly breaching US law. So it was pretty clear.
So if you wanted to commit a crime on the ISS, you would need to choose where you wanted to commit that crime, depending on the respective national laws.
It's interesting because when, the ISS is the most complex still, I think, cooperative venture in the world, technologically and whatever. And there are so many agreements that led to the ISS, but if you like, the highest agreement is what's called the Intergovernmental Agreement, 1998, where at the high level, they agree all the really, important things. And they went as far as to say, hey, if somebody commits a crime on the space station, we have to determine what law applies. It'll depend on their nationality, where they are, and so I've actually recently written a big piece with a colleague at one of my universities in Australia about crimes in space. And because space is an area beyond jurisdiction, we can have jurisdiction within objects. So in the space station, depending on which module you are, different laws will apply. But again, what happens if we're on the moon? We don't know.
Do you have any favorite crime in space that has actually happened?
Well, no, because things have happened that are way above my pay rate, I think, in terms of knowledge of knowing that they've happened. But there certainly have been suggestions that military activities have been undertaken on the space station, which would be contrary to the agreement, because it says absolutely clearly that the International Space Station is for peaceful uses.
Sure.
But I can't give you specifics because I don't know.
Okay, no worries. Steven, for aspiring law students who are still undecided yet, trial law, intellectual property law, tax law, or space law?
Well, I think definitely space law. Of course, you would be surprised if I said tax law. I hated tax law at university. But that said, space law is not just about a narrow field. Everything interacts with space, not just law, of course, politics and economy and culture, all the things I mentioned before. But from a legal perspective, so many different aspects of law are relevant. Environmental law, trade law, criminal law, as we've just discussed, human rights law. There's been very little done, for example, about human rights aspects of space, both how our use in space impacts on human rights on Earth, and then, as I indicated before, the human rights of people in space. Other areas of law, military law apply, and the list goes on. So actually, by doing space law, you're not going to be very good at what you do if you just narrowly focus on, a set of treaties and instruments. You need to have an open mind, because space is the only way we can even begin to find solutions to the questions that we don't even know what the questions are yet. But the only way we can find solutions is to have a holistic view. So a holistic view in terms of law,
sure.
But also we need to have, the philosophers and the filmmakers
sure.
and the doctors and the engineers and the scientists and the economists all in the same room as well. Yeah.
What's the top tier place to study space law these days?
Well, I don't want to play favorites because I'm associated with about 5 different universities around the world that teach it. But there's some, ones that have been around for a long time and really have great pedigree. At McGill University in Montreal, there's in Cologne, there's now in Nebraska they teach it, in Leiden, in London. But all over. Space has become incredibly sexy, and space law is becoming sexy as well. So more and more are teaching it, and that's a good thing.
Nice. Steven, I think you know how this podcast ends. It ends usually with a question I keep asking.
Oh dear!
And again. And so this podcast is called Space Cafe Podcast, and so it's a coffee place. And I guess you Australians also like to have an espresso now and then to energize your body. Now, why don't you give us an espresso for the mind? And you can pick whatever topic you want to pick.
Golly. Well, I think it goes hand in hand with your last question was about aspiring students. And just today I was talking to another student who was seeking my advice about how she should pursue her study and careers. And what I've found for myself is the idea that everybody has something to offer to you. And, this conversation, this is the first time you and I have spoken, and there's so much that I could outgain from just meeting you and talking. And I think it's the notion that we all from my perspective, I think we all just continue to learn. And there's never an end. One continually challenges. I'm a Sputnik baby. I'm 60. How old am I now? 64. And I still feel that I'm just beginning to learn. And so not taking yourself too seriously, or not thinking that you've reached the pinnacle of who you can be, and therefore everybody has to listen to you, but making sure that you listen to everybody, despite what you might think, given that I've been talking a lot on this podcast. I actually think I'm pretty good at listening to people, which is why I think I have this role at the UN. It's really listening and then trying to distill and bring out from people what you're very good at, Marcus. In your interviews, you're very good at listening and then distilling and bringing out. And I think we could do a lot of good in listening, learning, being a sponge, recognizing that, the joy, the view is to learn more and not take yourself too seriously, and recognize that everybody has something to offer. Everybody's a human being, and don't, try not to be too judgmental. Anyway, look, I sound like I'm your grandfather, Marcus, and giving advice, but you've sort of caught me on the hop because, had I known you were asking that question, I would have gone away and tried to think of something really, really clever. But maybe
that's
this
why
comes
we
more
don't talk
this
about
comes from
it
the
in
heart.
advance.
Maybe this comes a bit more out from the heart.
Wonderful. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that wonderful inspiration. That was really, really inspiring. Thank you, Steven Freeland, for your time.
Oh, Marcus, it's been a pleasure and an honor to speak to you. And thank you for listening to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you for spending time with us today. I'd like to take the opportunity to let you know about our supporter program over at SpaceWatch.Global. We hate traditional advertising from the bottom of our hearts because it is against our independence. That's why we don't want to recommend mattresses or anything like that to you. And if you share our beliefs, and if you think independence is important, we would be happy about any support from your side. Thank you for being with us today. See you soon.